Colorado. We're also delighted to be joined by the newest member of the Massachusetts delegation, Representative Jake Auchincloss. The moderator will be Lisa Desjardins from PBS NewsHour. We're meeting today in this Zoom webinar, which has allowed us to connect with a larger group of people. But we're all looking forward to a time in the not so distant future when we'll be meeting as well in person in our own replica of the U.S. Senate chamber, though we plan to maintain an online access component to our gatherings so that more can continue to participate. Meeting in person again, however, is important, and it's what we aim to achieve. As a legislator, and one known to be extraordinarily effective, my late husband, Senator Edward Kennedy, understood and believed in the power of face-to-face meetings because that's how he developed personal relationships. That's how he got to know his colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, and they got to know him. And for the most part, they really liked each other. And that made a huge difference in how they accomplished the business of being senators. Now, no one would deny that Teddy was a Democrat, and a joyously partisan one at that. But at the same time, he had warm friendships and good working relationships across the aisle. He believed that when you respected each other and listened to each other's points of view, you just might find a nugget of common ground that could move the ball forward. That, coupled with his patient, well-prepared perseverance, was the secret sauce of all that legislative achievement. We hope that programs like this one can help encourage those good working relationships, both across the aisle and across both houses of Congress. And we hope we can help foster an environment for those friendships and working relationships to flourish again. And with that, I'll turn the program over to Lisa Desjardins, who will first speak with Senators Lummis and Hickenlooper. Thank you all so much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Vicki, for that warm welcome. I am thrilled to be serving as the moderator for this event, especially as someone who was able to see Senator Kennedy and cover him up close. I know what Vicki is talking about in terms of the work he did to bridge relationships in the U.S. Senate. So this is a particular honor for me. The Across the Aisle program, of course, is important in bringing together members of Congress from both political parties to discuss areas of common ground. As Vicki said, today we will hear from Senators John Hickenlooper of Colorado and Senator Cynthia Lummus of Wyoming. Also, Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts will join us in a separate segment in a few minutes. If you have questions for these esteemed panelists, please type them into the Q&A area on your computer. You can locate that. There's an icon at the bottom of your screen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for this beginning. Senator Hickenlooper served as mayor of Denver before being elected as governor of Colorado from 2011 to 2019. He is Colorado's junior senator, but he's the only one who is a former geologist. He was a Democratic candidate for president, especially stressing proposals to address climate and energy. Senator Cynthia Lummis is the junior senator from Wyoming and the first female senator ever elected to represent the Equality State. She has dedicated her career to defending Wyoming's agriculture, mineral, and energy resources, and she served in the State House and Senate as the state treasurer and as an at-large member, I should say, of the U.S. House 2008 to 2016. These are two senators with wide-ranging and important experience. And I was able to touch base with both of you in person today. And one thing you both brought up, you're both new members of the Senate. But I want to first ask you, when talking about common ground, you're both former governors. How do you think that could make you more effective or perhaps help members yourselves bridge common ground? I guess Senator Hickenlooper first.
Well, I think if you've been a governor, you've developed a certain relationship with Congress and the federal government in Washington. That relationship is not always smooth. So in the implementation of some of the federal laws that are oftentimes it becomes one size fits all. Pretty much every state has unique situations, and so you have to work those out. And as a governor, you've been through a lot of those tussles and seen, I would just say, in some cases, overreach on the federal side. And at least I developed a certain respect for how hard it is for the federal government to create laws that really can be applied fairly to all parts of the country.
Senator Lummus. I think she joined us. Senator Lummus, I think we have you now.
Wonderful. Can you hear me?
I can. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
I was talking to Senator Hickenlooper about something I know close to your heart. The power of being a governor and having been a state or local official. What do you think that means to you as you look at the Senate, and how could that help try and bridge ground here, partisan ground at the Capitol?
Well, there are about 75 members of the U.S. Senate that were either governors, secretaries of state, treasurer, county commissioners, mayors, and because of that, they know how to get things done at the local level. And so many of those levels of government are not either partisan or as partisan as things are in Washington. So they come here to the U.S. Senate with a very different perspective. I'm sure that former Governor Hickenlooper has talked to you about that. In the Western Governors Association, which is made up of, I believe, the 17 Western states and the 4 island governments, they alternate between a Democrat chairman and a Republican chairman every couple of years. And so it forces everybody to be more bipartisan and really look at the issues that are regional as opposed to the issues that are partisan. So I think people like Governor Hickenlooper, now Senator Hickenlooper, come here with that kind of a perspective, and it sort of changes the way that you even think about issues.
I believe when Ted Kennedy first joined the U.S. Senate, it was a place where senators spent a good deal of time with each other. They knew their families. They had dinner together. There are many famous, some infamous stories about legends of different meals held together. But even before the pandemic, that kind of culture was waning. Of course, you want to spend time in your state, understandably. But I want to ask both of you as freshman members of the Senate, what has the reception been like? Have you been able to get to know other members? And can you also bring in that layer of this particular partisan time? And since January, feelings have been very raw on partisan lines here in the Capitol. Have people been getting to know each other well? I guess Senator Lummis?
Well, I think for me, it's been particularly negative, the experience so far. I don't think it'll stay that way. I think that we've got nowhere to go but up. But January 6th really set a tone that has been tough to deal with. Senator Hickenlooper can offer a different perspective, but my perspective is this. The Democrats have been mourning ever since President Trump left because they don't have anybody to hate anymore. So they are turning their venom and their bile and their rancor elsewhere. And it's some of that's landed on me and some of the other Republicans. So for us, it's been a particularly difficult and acrimonious time to be here. I was hoping that after our last long break, that would change. It's starting to thaw a little bit. We're going to have a week off over Mother's Day. I think that'll further thaw things. So the farther we get away from January 6th, the impeachment trial, the all-night voting that we did during reconciliation, the better.
I was here the morning for that. I was here for that all-night voting for part of it, not all of it. So I know what you're talking about. Senator Hickenlooper, what do you think? Are things thawing? I know that you have tried to reach across the aisle. Do you feel that you're able to get the time to get to know members of the other party?
Well, not as much time as I think we need. But I think it's worth pointing out that we are just people. And as I was walking through the office building where my office is, called the Russell Building, and the ceilings are about 22 feet high. And I was trying to think back when they built this building 125 years ago for the Senate, why these incredibly high corridors? And it struck me that, there are a lot of big egos that get, they go through life and they get elected to the Senate. And this is a way of making everyone feel that they are no better, no bigger than anyone else. And it's funny, it's going to come down to people. And I will say this, that Cynthia, Senator Lummus, reached out to me right at the very beginning of our stay, right after we got sworn in. And we're both on the same subcommittee of the Commerce Department. So we're both on the Space and Science Subcommittee of Commerce. And I mean, it was just such I thought, a really big-hearted thing for her to do, to reach out and invite me to her office. We could hear about each other's, childhoods. We could actually get a feel for each other before we got into the rush and the craziness of these condensed legislative days. And I think we need more of that. And I have not, I'm determined to take her out for dinner or lunch. Or I think when you break bread with people, you go to the next level of, all of a sudden you do have a little more trust and a better relationship. So that's part of my goal, is to reach out to Senator Lummis and a number of other Republicans. Once the election's over, we're all just trying to work for the best we can for our states and for our country.
Mm-hmm. And I should disclose to everyone listening, some of them probably already know, you're not just any members of that space subcommittee, you are the two leading members of that space subcommittee, which is also very valuable to see you all communicating so well with each other. We are getting some questions in. I'm going to put my glasses in. Speaking of January 6th, I lost my glasses on January 6th in the riot. So these are my new pair that I'm trying out. They're quite large.
Nice.
All right. Thank you.
I like them too.
Thank you. They're controversial among PBS viewers. Here are some questions for you. Let me ask, first of all, a very good broad question. How do you define servant leader, the term servant leader, in partisan times? I think that's a question about allegiances and loyalty and getting things done, not just with your party. Senator Hickenlooper?
Yeah, and I love the term. I have an old friend, Denny Myers, who owns a bunch of restaurants in New York. He started Shake Shack, and he wrote a book called Setting the Table, which is about service. And when I was chair of the National Governors Association back, I guess it was 2014, I had him come speak to all the governors about what service means. And for him, if you're running a restaurant, your first priority is to serve the people you work with, all your employees. And if you serve them with your heart and your soul, then they will serve the customers. And I think a servant leader is someone who believes that they may be a leader, but they're also a servant. And they're not any better or any different than the people that they're trying to lead. They are, in a funny way, a servant of the people they're trying to lead.
Senator Lummis.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I feel like a servant when I'm in Wyoming. And then when I'm in Washington, the leader hat comes on. I run into people at the grocery store, and they've had trouble getting their Social Security, or their elderly mother has not been able to fill out her IRS tax return online, and they need the help of our office. And so I run around grocery stores taking down names and phone numbers and give them to my staff so they can help these friends and neighbors of ours in Wyoming. And that's when I feel like a servant, and it's a really good feeling. And then when I'm in Washington, I get to work with people like Senator Hickenlooper on space. I think about that. I mean, I was a little kid showing sheep in 4-H, and now, and cattle in 4-H, and now we're talking about putting a woman on the moon. We're talking about Mars missions. We're talking about cleaning up satellite parts and space junk. And I couldn't even dream of having those kinds of discussions. So space is a really fun place to have a bipartisan working relationship, because space is not a partisan topic. An old friend of mine, Jim Bridenstine, just left as the head of NASA. And now a former U.S. Senator from Florida is coming in as the new head of NASA. And everybody's excited about it. It's very bipartisan. So what a fun place to land as the ranking member and working with my neighbor in Colorado, who is the chairman of the subcommittee on space. It's a great place to start working relationships on an issue that's not acrimonious. It's so great not to be talking about the border, getting a position dealing with the border and having to chair or being ranking member and talk about all the border controversies and things like that. So we just lucked out. It's a wonderful assignment.
This leads to another good question that we're getting as well, which is essentially, what are the mechanisms for members to come together and discuss policy and formulate bipartisan solutions? I know that recently Democrats have returned to having their in-person lunches. That's a relatively new thing. Republicans have been having those in-person lunches for several months. But those are just with your parties. And I'm just so curious, as both of you have such deep lawmaking governance experience, but as freshmen of this sort of very specific body of Congress, have you found, what are the ways that you can actually formulate policy within your caucuses, but also across the aisle? Do you feel like those mechanisms even exist? Senator Hickenlooper?
Yeah, they're not enough. And for the last decade or so, maybe even longer than that, but certainly for the last decade, there's been an emphasis on senators being able to go home to their home state every weekend and really do the constituent services that Cynthia was describing. And I think that's incredibly valuable. So you take your last vote on a Thursday afternoon, you fly home, you get most senators get home late on Thursday night, and then Friday and Saturday and sometimes part of Sunday, you'll go out and talk to your neighbors and try and get across the state. And then you come back on Monday to Washington. But that means the work in the Capitol, in Congress, is condensed into 4 days. And so it's day and night, and you don't have a lot of opportunities to just hang out with people from the other party. And I'm going to start trying, once I get settled in a little better, I'm going to try and rotate weekends and try and find some other Republican senators and convince them that we should all stay in Washington on the same weekend, and that I'll cook dinner. We'll do something special and make an event of it. And if you can do that a couple times a month, maybe that becomes the start of getting more people to spend a little more time getting to know each other.
Senator Lummis, are you ready to go to dinner at Senator Hickenlooper's house?
Are you kidding? He had a restaurant. He's a restaurateur. He knows how to entertain people. I'd be delighted. And if you wanted to host it right where he's at right now, isn't he in a beautiful space? I want you to know that it's not because Democrats, being in the majority, are treated like kings and have chairs behind them, and Republicans have to bring in plants to their offices so they have a little bit of ambiance. I think we're just both off the Senate floor in different rooms because we're between two votes. But I got to say, Senator Hickenlooper, it looks really nice where you are. I mean, you look like royalty. And I'd love to have dinner. Last night when I was heading back to my apartment, I ran into Senator Hickenlooper and Senator Klobuchar having dinner. So I stopped and said hello. I mean, I really think things are coming along in terms of the thaw after January 6th. And I do think that there are going to be opportunities to get things done. And the Senate is designed because of the 60 vote requirement. It's just designed to try to get people, to force people across the line. And having a 50-50 Senate, to really get things done, we're just going to have to do it. We're going to have to work together across the line. I was in the Wyoming legislature for 14 years, always with a Democrat governor. I was in the U.S. House for 8 years, always with a Democrat president. I went home, completely missed the Trump years. Now I'm back and we have a Democrat president. So in all of my legislative time, I've never been in a situation where the executive branch was in the same party as mine. So to me, this is very familiar territory. And I just, it's just how it is. And we want to get things done, which is what I do. Look, I'm 66 years old. I'm not in this trying to climb. This is my last stop politically, and I want to get some things done. So one of the great things about the Senate is not only do you need 60 votes, you've got 6 years to try to accomplish some things. So it requires some patience, but I believe we've got it. And this is a very capable, impressive, hardworking bunch of people. And I just believe we're gonna get some things done.
I love the optimism. That's great. I think, Senator Hickenlooper, you have participated in some bipartisan meetings since you've been here with some groups. We've got a question here mentioning the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House, which this questioner says has made good progress in getting bipartisan discussion. Do you think there will be a formal parallel group in the Senate? Is that possible?
Yes, it's certainly been talked about, and I think that it'll definitely happen. I think just what Cynthia was describing, that there is an appetite for people that want to get things done. There's an appetite for them to come together, and you have to work together to get to 60 votes. And a problem solvers caucus where you pick certain issues that both sides care about. We may have a few skirmishes about the details, but making sure that broadband gets to every farm and every ranch and every corner of our cities, that everybody gets broadband. That's something that I think both parties can agree on, and make sure that kids have the skills and the training to have quality jobs as this economy, continues to disrupt the workplace. Those are the kinds of things that there's not necessarily, one party that owns all the right answers. I think the more we can talk to each other and listen and try to find common ground, the more rapidly we can make progress.
Mm-hmm. Senator Lummis, he just mentioned broadband. That's such a great example of an issue I've watched for so many years. It's been talked about. We know it's bipartisan, but yet Congress has not been able to make the kind of progress that seems like it should be easy on that issue. And I think part of it, you can comment too, part of it obviously is because national politics play a big role. One party in control doesn't want to give credit to the other party, and back and forth. Can you speak to how can you talk to that mentality here? How do people deal with the idea of trying to get something done versus the idea of our party winning the next election? Do you hear both of those pressures, and where do they stand in the world of the Senate from what you know?
Well, with regard to broadband, and this is true of other issues, COVID happening sort of showed the soft underbelly of where we have gaps in our broadband that maybe hadn't been seen before. We had kids in some rural areas, because they were going to school online, that would have to drive to their high school parking lot in order to get enough broadband capacity or signal to do their online education. Well, during COVID, those kinds of stories just drove home how important it is that we address these issues in a bipartisan manner. And because there may be some urban situations that are similar, and it showed up during COVID. There may be supply chain issues that were exposed during COVID. The fact that we're so dependent on China for rare earth minerals. These are the kind of things that maybe you can wrestle about or be a little parochial about or partisan about, but COVID sort of leveled the playing field and wiped out that partisanship, because we saw the actual effects on everyday Americans of not addressing these issues. So I think, if you're looking for the silver lining behind something like COVID when it comes to policy making, I think that's it.
Do you think, and then for both of you, I know that we are wrapping up this portion with you, and I want to highlight why. It's because you are two working senators in the middle of important Senate votes. One of you is about to preside over the Senate. That's, of course, you, Senator Hickenlooper. So we really appreciate your valuable time. But just so that everyone watching understands, these are working senators doing their work right now. But I want to ask you all just about that pressure to win the next election versus the pressure to get something done. It seems to me that that's been the rising move, is talking about the next election lately. But do you hope that could change, or how could that change? Senator Hickenlooper?
Well, I think we share this. Cynthia and I are both, we're not going to serve 5 terms in the Senate and rise in seniority and acquire chairs of the major committees. We're going to be here for a couple terms max, and we're going to focus on trying to, nudge the universe just a little bit and create some real progress. And again, the only way to do that is to work together on a bipartisan basis. And I look forward to working with Cynthia. I think it's great. The governor, when I was governor of Colorado, Matt Mead was the governor of Wyoming, one of my favorite governors, and to this day, still a good friend. And he's a pretty conservative Republican, but we found all kinds of things we could work on.
Senator Lummis.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And as I said, I'm just really optimistic going forward. It's been the worst possible, toughest way to start a new Senate term. But I think that everybody is in the mood to work together now. And of course, the closer we get to the next election, the more partisan it's going to be. We all know that the other parties out there raising money and trying to recruit candidates and trying to find people to run for these open seats or seats that we think are vulnerable. And now that we've got the census data, we know that there's going to be new seats in some states and fewer in others, and that opens up opportunities for both parties. So yes, it'll get partisan, very partisan next year. But my gosh, if we can start on some subjects now, the low-hanging fruit, the kind of things that John Hickenlooper and I have been talking about on this call, we can make a lot of progress before things get to where they grind to a halt. And for those of us who were just elected in 2020, we can help raise money for our parties to go spend to help other candidates, but we're not up ourselves. And so we can try to keep the policy issues going while others are in the fray.
That's a very good point. Senators John Hickenlooper and Cynthia Lummis, cannot thank you enough. This was a very interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing about all of the dinners that come from it, hopefully soon.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Thank you. For everyone watching, we're now going to enter the second portion of this conversation. And before we do, I just want to remind you, please send in your questions. We've been getting so many good ones. That is at the Q&A button. It's an icon at the bottom of your screen. I'm now happy to transition to another freshman member of Congress. This is Jake Auchincloss of the great state of Massachusetts. Congressman, hi, good to see you.
Good afternoon, Lisa. Nice to see you.
Great. And I'm going to I've introduced you to our audience a little bit. Here's what I've got on you. Congressman Jake Auchincloss joined the Marines after college, where he commanded infantry in Afghanistan and special operations in Panama. He is now a major in the reserves, won election to the Newton City Council in 2015, and won a competitive primary for the open seat that he now knows. As he also knows, I have family from Massachusetts, so I know that he's got a lot of passionate voters, a lot of passionate Red Sox fans in his district. Thank you again for joining us, Congressman. We've been talking about what it's like to be a freshman member right now in this time of partisanship, and I'm especially interested in your perspective as someone who came from really the most local level of government, city council, very vigorous. I'm sure you had many long meetings that affected not just people's large issues, but their blocks down to their homes and their neighborhoods. How do you view becoming a congressman? Have you picked up on what is different here, especially in working with the other party or not?
It's early days still. I would say, though, that there is absolutely a distinction between local and state government and federal government. And the public agrees. If you look at Pew Research studies over the last 70 years, what you see is declining trust in the federal government and relatively solid trust in state and local government, indeed even enhanced trust in local government over the last 25 years. And I think that's because there's a higher threshold of democratic credibility at the local level. People can touch and feel their local representatives. I would get stopped walking my dog or in the grocery store about land use issues and environmental and transportation issues. And it's also solution oriented. It's largely nonpartisan. And while there's full and frank and fierce debate at times, at the end of the day, you've got to pave the road. You've got to build the school. You've got to approve the special permit or not. you can't pontificate ad nauseum. So I think the lessons to me of local government, what I'm bringing with me to Congress, is really trying to be solution oriented and dial back the pontification and lean more into the solutions that actually we can get across the finish line.
This is a fascinating time for so many reasons, but one of them is because both chambers have historically close margins between the two different parties. And yet, I don't know that has necessarily sparked bipartisanship. You talk to me with the close margin in the House from your observations. What's that meant? Has that meant more relationships, or has it meant Democrats and you're kind of gathering together to make sure they have all their votes? Again, thinking about what can be conducive to everyone speaking to each other.
Tight margins definitely means that the caucus needs to stick together on key Democratic priorities. We have in Speaker Pelosi an absolute artist in that vein. So she is doing a terrific job in that. I'm no doubt that she'll continue to, in concert with Leader Schumer and President Biden. I think the first 100 days have been probably easier to maintain unity within the caucus than it might be going forward, because we had the reaction to the insurrection and to the impeachment of Donald Trump, which was a highly unifying event. We saw behavior that was clearly contrary to, not just Democratic values, American values. We bonded together in opposition to that and to holding that president to account. And then the American Rescue Plan was meeting the crisis head on. After a year of incompetent federal leadership, we had a president who was ready to do what was necessary to end this pandemic and to help us build back better. And there has been strong unity across the caucus in this was the right thing to do. And as we're seeing right now with the response to the American Rescue Plan, we've got the support of the supermajority of the American people, as well as state and local leaders of both parties.
You are also, of course, a member of the military. And I'm wondering if that you found presents any opportunities to forge relationships with Republicans. Again, I know the pandemic has made things much more difficult in terms of getting to know other members, but have you found that to possibly be a conduit to kind of some common ground?
Yes. Being a veteran, regardless of party affiliation, you start with just a higher amount of rapport and trust. And I've seen that in my conversations with Republican legislators and with Democratic legislators. It's just, you start at like level 3 as opposed to level 1 right off the bat. Doesn't mean
or
that you're
negative 1 sometimes when it's so
or negative 1. Exactly. Doesn't mean that you're going to agree on every issue, but it does make that the personal rapport that can become the seed of political partnership easier to develop.
We're getting a lot of great questions in for you. One is, do you think it's easier to work across the aisle as a newly elected member of Congress as opposed to one who's been here for a number of years?
No, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I mean, we're at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute event right now. Ted Kennedy was in the Senate for a long time, and nobody was better at reaching across the aisle when necessary than he was. So I actually might almost say the opposite, in the sense that as people gain tenure in the House and the Senate, they earn the trust of their voters in their respective bases for over and over again. They've proven that they stand up for the core principles of their party. And so when they do reach across the aisle and take a little bit of a political risk, they have more confidence that their voters understand that they're doing it pragmatically, but they're not getting unanchored from core principles of that party. So I might honestly even say the opposite.
That's interesting. Another question that sort of tags into that is, do new members of Congress receive any training in the art of negotiation or working with members who have different political views, not just from your own party, but beyond that?
You don't, although you get a class in it in praxis. I took the Harvard Law Negotiation Workshop when I was a business school student, and it was one of the most important classes I've ever taken, undergrad or graduate, because it was a month-long seminar in how to find common ground on difficult issues. And the core takeaway of that for me has been that people sort of naively assume that similarities are what drive agreements. And the takeaway from that seminar is actually differences is what can make agreements easier. If people have different expectations about the future end state of something, if people have different valuations on what's important, it's actually easier to find compromises that serve both sides. When you've got a pie and both people agree on everything, and cutting that pie gets super challenging. So I don't always view differences of opinion as a liability when we're talking about negotiations. I view it as an opportunity for how to be creative.
Huh. That's interesting. That reminds me of something that Vicki Kennedy said at the beginning of this seminar here, this conversation, where she talked about her late husband as being joyously partisan.
That's right.
Right. And it was such an interesting phrase to me. And I wonder, when you think about yourself or you think about what is important in what you're doing, what could fit that as joyously partisan that you think the other party might be able to understand, even if they don't agree?
Ooh. So I'll take an issue on which I am unapologetically partisan, and that's gun violence. I think Republicans are just crazy about guns. I do not understand their opinion on guns whatsoever. I was a Marine officer. I slept, ate, trained, and patrolled with an assault weapon. No citizen needs to carry a weapon of war like that. We should have a federal assault weapon ban. We should have a ban on 30-round magazines. We should have universal background checks and safe storage laws. By the way, the supermajority of voters agree with me on all these issues. So I would be perfectly happy, and indeed I would be ecstatic, to pass gun safety legislation on partisan lines, because I know it's a unifying issue. There is, I think, the opportunity to extend an olive branch to some Republicans, with the issue of something like liability insurance. Liability insurance basically says if you purchase a firearm, you've got to also buy liability insurance for the use of that firearm. It takes personal ownership over how that gun is stored and whose hands it ends up in. This sort of allows, this is kind of in the same vein as what Republicans talk about with individual responsibility and market forces kind of correcting problems. Say, okay, liability insurance can help do that. Why not institute that as part of a package of gun safety reforms?
That's an interesting example. How do lawmakers talk to each other right now? It's in bringing in the pandemic and also bringing in kind of the partisan era that we're in.
Well, right now, not enough because of the pandemic. It's still there's a big subset of our events that are just either canceled or virtual. And as everybody listening, I'm sure would agree, Zoom ain't real life. I mean, it can be good for some things, but you're not having those sidebar conversations, you're not having those serendipitous bump-ins that really drive the activity. When I'm walking on the House floor during votes, I learn more in 20 minutes from finding that person or that person than I do in a week behind a Zoom screen. So not enough of it's happening. I can tell you the way I've sort of been approaching it, given the limited bandwidth available to us, is sort of a series of concentric circles. I'm starting reaching out to lawmakers actually at the state level in my district. And as a freshman, I am marrying my district. So I want to hear from every state rep, every state senator, every mayor about what's going on. We've been heavily engaged. I spent a lot of time on the phone hearing about those issues. Next outward circle has been other Democratic members of the committees I'm on, Financial Services and T&I. Then the other Republican members of those committees, and then finally the wider caucus, and then finally the Republican conference. So I'm trying to think about it in terms of concentric circles, the most important relationships to forge, the ones that on which you've got to build a foundation, are really the district level ones, and then wider out into my colleagues on the issue sets that I'm working on.
That raises a great issue that I know you've spent a lot of time talking about, which of course is infrastructure. And some of the folks watching this may be like, oh, infrastructure week, we get it. But I do think, you and I have talked about this, that this is a special moment potentially right now. Can you talk about if you think what the bipartisan potential is for infrastructure? We know that Democrats are reopening the potential for earmarks. Specific projects, they're going to call them congressionally designated projects in one form. And the problem being, though, that there may need to be what could be a partisan vote in the Senate on a reconciliation bill to get through infrastructure. So can you talk about how this is viewed in your district, this opportunity? Is it viewed as bipartisan? And then the reality in Congress, do you think it will be bipartisan?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the distinction between bipartisanship in the Beltway and outside the Beltway, because I think about it very much through that lens. The American Rescue Plan was passed on a partisan line vote, and yet Republicans throughout the country, including local leaders and state leaders, have been pretty clear that they think the American Rescue Plan was superb legislation, and it polls still at above 70% on most of what it accomplished. American Jobs Plan is similar. This is something that Americans across the ideological spectrum feel that we need: investments in roads and bridges and clean energy and broadband and clean water. So when I think about unity and bipartisanship behind a piece of legislation, my first reference point is actually in the district. And folks are going to assume Massachusetts, you must have a deep blue district. Yes, it's considered to be a safe blue seat, but southeastern Massachusetts in particular is not, we're not talking deep blue. This is areas that swung towards Trump between 2016 and 2020. These are areas that have majority Republican select boards and mayors and town managers. And so when I have conversations with those folks, I am not necessarily speaking within my ideological domain, but I'm hearing from them, they want to see significant federal investment in their communities. So that's my primary reference point for this legislation.
That's interesting. So then when you bring that here to Congress, you're thinking then about something beyond the people voting here in this body. You're thinking about the people in your district. How do you mesh that then with there are partisans here who are thinking really just about the next election mainly, or is that a myth?
Well, I mean, I think any elected official needs to have a healthy fear, frankly, of their electorate. You want to be thinking about the voters, and you want to be queuing closely to their opinion. And if you're going to diverge from their opinion, which sometimes is the right thing to do, you should do it with very deeply considered judgment and with darn good rationale for why you're disagreeing with your electorate. I don't have any issue with representatives representing their districts, and we have a kaleidoscope of socioeconomic and cultural opinions across this country. So I think disagreement is healthy. I don't even necessarily think partisanship is necessarily a four-letter word in a lot of cases. Partisanship reflects the fact that we have different perspectives that are relatively correlated about how best to achieve outcomes. What's important to me, though, is shared reality and unity around common American core principles. Shared reality is one that we've been getting unmoored from over the last 15 years and accelerated over the last 5 years. 30-40% of the American electorate thinks that the 2020 election was rigged in some fashion. The QAnon cult has gone viral. These are things that deeply concern me because we're talking about a divergent set of facts.
That in some part is a conversation about the media that obviously we're thinking a lot about as well, right? And how we do our jobs and put out the truth. What do we give oxygen to? What do we not? But I'm curious, and this leads to another question that someone else has raised too. To stay elected, do you feel the need to balance the needs of your party versus the needs of your constituents? In your district, that may line up well. I don't know.
Well, I guess what I would say is that one's fairly easy. I mean, district is always first. I mean, every member of Congress will respect that answer. If you say to somebody in Congress, listen, this legislation is bad for my district, they'll say, I get it. Okay. I mean, they may still try to twist your arm because that's their job, but they respect that your job is to represent your district and not to vote against your district's interests. So that one is not so much a tension that I experience. I do think that the Democratic Party in general is a big tent. I don't think that's any secret. We are a big tent. We have less ideological homogeneity than the Republican Party does. A very vibrant debate, and there's going to be continuing, I think, stories and pressures around the divergence between the different sets within the Democratic Party. That to me is healthy. That has never to me been something to shy away from. We're trying to figure out the best way to get healthcare to people. We're trying to figure out the best way to fund infrastructure. Those are good debates to have.
I hear from you that argument again about being joyously partisan, even if that's partisan within your own family, I suppose. So, another question. This is a simple one, but I'm so intrigued with the answer. What is something that has surprised you about Congress?
So as a city councilor, I didn't have any staff. It was a part-time job. I was working in the private sector. And so it was like I was doing my own office hours. I was doing my own email. I was doing my own policy research, my own constituent communications, and then took a fairly significant jump from like part-time city council to full-time member of Congress. And I have a staff in district and in Washington. And the amount of delegation that goes into that, the amount of stuff that happens that's staff directed in Congress and how much staff runs my life has been a surprise to me.
There's a lot of coordination. I know there's a famous handbook I think everyone receives when they're a freshman. It's the handbook. It's really like this thick, just for managing essentially the office and knowing the rules of how to operate here. I think that makes sense. When I ask that question, I often also get, in the first 2 months of a new Congress, often a lot of questions about how simply to get from point A to point B.
Constantly lost. I have a terrible sense of direction, which is ironic because I was a reconnaissance Marine, which were meant to be like behind enemy lines, navigating in the dark. I can't find my way from here to the Capitol Rotunda.
Well, by means of trying to help the conversation, I think on both sides, I can give you my tip for navigating Congress, which is pick 1 or 2 elevator banks.
That's right.
Know those elevator banks up and down, and then you're going to be okay. Then you'll be good. I'm wondering, do you think in New England, the New England delegation, which used to be a fairly bipartisan delegation,
right,
years ago, and not all that long ago, but is now primarily Democratic, with Susan Collins in Maine, Republican. But do you see things that New England is pushing for that could be bipartisan?
Offshore wind is definitely a strong bipartisan issue. Clean energy in general, I would say that's a big one. Offshore wind is particularly important to my district. The coast of Martha's Vineyard is probably the greatest offshore wind resource in the Western Hemisphere, and the onshore landing points for the wind that would be generated off the coast of Martha's Vineyard comes into New Bedford and then off the Taunton River and places like Brayton Point and Somerset. We have the potential to do for southeastern Massachusetts with offshore wind what life sciences did for Boston and Cambridge in the early 2000s. And that's the second issue where that there's strong bipartisan support. Really, actually, throughout Congress has been biomedical R&D. That predates the pandemic, but I'm sure that will only accelerate after the pandemic.
And what do you think? What would you hope from the federal government? I'm sure that's a bigger conversation, but just in general, what should the federal government be doing to support that?
Biomedical R&D or offshore wind?
Offshore wind.
So, a great start was just issuing the permit. So the Trump administration, and a lot of areas where the Trump administration couldn't get what it wanted done legislatively, they just broke the administration apparatus and they governed through incompetence. And they did that with offshore wind. So that we saw that with immigration, for example. They just broke the immigration courts because they didn't like immigration rather than go through Congress. They did that with offshore wind. They just wouldn't issue the permits. The Biden administration came in and issued the permits. So that has been a great start. And then the second is infrastructure investment. It's expensive to set up the terminals to actually have a landing site for offshore wind, the connectivity lines to onshore. And that's an important site. And then workforce development. I've issued a request for appropriations funding for the National Offshore Wind Institute through Bristol Community College to help train people for the offshore wind jobs of the next 10 years.
There's that old joke about the U.S. Senator saying that essentially, no, the other party's not the enemy. It's the other chamber. It's the House that's the enemy. But I want to ask you a question about the U.S. Senate, because the filibuster in the U.S. Senate is the primary reason that Democrats can't pass much of what they would like to. Not everything. As you say, Democrats have their own disagreements. But I'm curious your thoughts on the filibuster, because those who defend it say it is an important tool of forcing bipartisanship, that a supermajority is good to have in one chamber in order to force agreement. Obviously the critics of it say no, it gets in the way of majority rule. But I'm curious your thoughts on that as someone who really does obviously want to expand the conversation.
Yes, and I'm hesitant to weigh into too much about the Senate because I'm learning the House still.
You're smart. It's wise. I get it. Yes.
I have been very.
This is a question from somebody who's watching. I'll defend myself on that.
I have been very clear on the record that we should abolish the filibuster. This is not some sacrosanct constitutional principle from the pen of James Madison. This is an obscure 19th century parliamentary maneuver that was weaponized to first defend Jim Crow and then to try to defeat civil rights legislation, and then finally to try to undermine the Obama agenda. Time and time again, it's just been used to undermine the advancement of civil rights. We cannot effectively govern as a chamber. I don't mean from getting Democratic priorities passed. I mean truly, we cannot legislate effectively with the 60 vote threshold in place right now. The filibuster has close to broken Congress. And what that has done under both parties is lend more and more power to the presidency. It's created a vacuum that the presidency has filled. And that's just unhealthy, period, for a democracy. So Congress needs to reassert its Article I powers over war, over domestic policy. And part of doing that is getting rid of the sclerosis in the Senate by abolishing the filibuster.
Two more questions for you, Congressman. This one also comes from someone who's watching, participating with us. Do your core values as a member of the military, as a veteran, get you through your challenging days? How does that experience help you in this challenging environment of the Hill?
Short answer is yes, and there are a number of maxims from my military training that I hold near to my heart. One is integrity, and my colleague in the northern part of Massachusetts, Seth Moulton, oftentimes says that in Marine Corps training, you could fail a run, you could drop out of a hike, you probably get a second chance. If you lied, that was it, you were done, you're out. So number one, tell the truth. And I think that has unfortunately become increasingly important these days in politics. And then also the maxim that officers eat last. That is drilled into you from the very first day you step foot in Quantico. Officers eat last. And as public servants, we need to remember that regardless of whatever the prestige or the perks of the office, you are there to serve your constituents, and their interests always come ahead of your own.
My other question is about you as a parent. I have a 5-year-old son, and I know you have an even smaller child, and I understand your family may be growing soon. Is that correct?
We have a daughter on the way due in August.
Congratulations. I think my question is, what do you hope? I know this question is asked a lot. I don't mean it to be cliche, but I do think it's something parents think about. And in the name of being more human here in Congress, what do you hope that they get from what you do in Congress? What do you want them to know about after your career here is done, whenever that may be?
Two things I would say. One is millennials, my generation, are the first generation in American history on track to have lower standards of living than our parents. First time in 400 years that's the case in America. We still have time to fix that for the millennial generation, and I think the American Jobs Plan is an important step in that direction. But we certainly can and should try to fix that for my children's generation. I want to bestow on them a government, a planet, a society healthier, more fair, more prosperous than the one I was given. That's really been a core tenet of the American experiment. And then the second is, I don't want them to grow up in a cynical environment. One of the things I'm most grateful for is that I grew up fundamentally optimistic about American politics. I had dinner every Sunday night with my grandmother, and her brother and dad had worked in the Roosevelt and Kennedy administrations. And she talked about public service as something that was very noble. And it sounds almost quaint these days, but it was something that she was so proud of. And she thought politics was a noble profession. And I want my kids to feel that way too. Cynicism is easy. I think it's kind of lazy. Optimism is much harder. And being a productive rather than a destructive member of the body politic is really one of the best features of the American story.
Congressman Jake Auchincloss, thank you so much. And I'm glad that you ended this session because you hit on two of the very big themes that we've heard in the past hour, which is optimism from these new members of Congress that we like to see, and then the idea of the service part of public service being so critical. So thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in with us for this Edward M. Kennedy Institute New Faces of Congress Across the Aisle seminar. Continue to stick with us, and thank you.